Greetings again, Souls fans. So far, I've done videos about my favorite areas and bosses in the Soulsborne games, and this time I wanted to talk about, let's say, the more frustrating areas in the games. I wanted to be careful not to call any area outright bad, although we will touch on a couple that definitely push into that territory, but rather ones that caused me a fair amount of grief. Some I also chose because when I thought about it, they were the places I dreaded going through on subsequent playthroughs. I will say that it's a testament to how well designed the games are as a whole that it was much easier to come up with this list, whereas I had an abundance of favorites to come through on my best areas video. As before, these are all my personal opinions, and I realize some of these might even be enjoyable to some people. At any rate, let's dive in. I did want to have one area from Elden Ring on this list, and Elden Ring is difficult to pick a frustrating area because it's open world, and as such has literally hundreds of locations that are essentially optional. Still, Lake of Rot came to mind initially, and then when I replayed it for this video, I realized I still really disliked the area personally. As part of Ranni's questline, it's technically essential, at least if you're going for that ending, so it's only optional to an extent. My biggest thing is I'm just not a fan of areas that require the player to just tank through poison, toxic, or other status effects that drain your health over time. When you first arrive, the platforms are spaced apart just enough so it's impossible not to be afflicted, requiring the player to pop boluses like candy. The location also features a dragonkin soldier fight balanced upon small platforms, which isn't super fun. And I hope you like fighting those insect guys because there's about 20 or so in the temple area. To top it off, an ulcerated tree spirit waits behind a waterfall, and I still struggle with those even at high levels. So what's the good here? Well, the area is adjacent to one of the prettiest areas in the game with Noxtella, and the Astel boss fight is really visually interesting. Also, as we all know, Ranni is waifu. As with Elden Ring, I struggled to actually find areas I dreaded in Sekiro. Chalk it up to great design all around. Still, I found Sunken Valley to be the most frustrating. Located past the gun fort, the Sunken Valley houses the Guardian Ape, a fight I actually love, but getting to him through a gauntlet of monkeys armed with guns isn't always a picnic. The monkeys holding two swords, for whatever reason, are some of the hardest non-boss enemies in the entire game. And the entire swamp below the giant statues is poisonous. The monkeys are immune to poison, by the way. Whenever I'm playing through this area again, I always feel like I'm narrowly avoiding getting clipped at every turn. Thankfully, the place is incredibly short, especially if you know where you're going, and as I said before, the Guardian Ape fight is a big highlight of the game for me. Harvest Valley, an area around the midpoint of Dark Souls 2, isn't an inherently bad area, but it's not optional, and it's a place I dread as soon as I pass through the threshold of the entrance. With Harvest Valley, it's again a case where the player has to trudge through a metric ton of poison mist. This wouldn't be that terrible, but there are several blind tunnels throughout that are easy to get lost and poisoned to death in. Dark Souls 2 went full ham with certain mechanics like torches and poison, and this place features the latter in spades. Add in the desert pyromancers pelting you from above at several points, a boss that's an absolute joke, in an area that just isn't particularly interesting, and I think this puts Harvest Valley on this list, if at least towards the bottom spots. I do like some of the puzzle mechanics, and the view from Earthen Peak looking down into the valley can be satisfying. I was initially conflicted about the order in which to put the Dark Souls 3 areas that I chose to be in this list, but after inspection, I think Irithyll Dungeon is number 7. Featuring more of the claustrophobic design From loves to roll out, the dungeon is an offshoot of Irithyll proper, which is a place I actually named as one of my favorite areas in a previous video. My main beef with this place is the jailers, which drain your health bar, and by that I mean the bar itself, not just the amount, to a sliver, and also the cattle prods that make rolling impossible. The super narrow corridors inhibit sword swings, and the run from bonfire to bonfire can be a huge pain, especially before unlocking the shortcuts. Lastly, I like the visual reveal of the profane capital, but the overall area feels a bit rushed and unfinished. Not Lost Izalith unfinished, mind you, but just a bit undercooked. The Ritual Path in Demon Souls, also known as level 4-2, is again not an inherently bad area, but it is, in my opinion, victim to some of the mercilessness of early Souls games. I like some of the visual design of the area, but having to run from the Archstone to the boss with basically zero shortcuts. And remember, this is from an era when Souls games didn't have overly generous bonfire placement, is a little insane. The 3 waves of necromancers that endlessly spawn enemies are a pain, and even if you sprint through the level, it's easy to get tripped up on one of the many hazards. The saving grace? The boss is thankfully pretty easy when you do finally manage to get to him, but there's so much pressure not to die and have to replay the entire level again. Brutal. I hate to drag DS3 into this too much, because it's pretty fantastic overall, but I have a hard time justifying the Farron Swamp area every consecutive playthrough. I'm also not a fan of the catacombs after, but I decided not to put them on this list. The area is just not enjoyable to me to go through, what with the constant poison and slow-moving mud, and yes, I know there's ways around those issues, but having to scour almost the entire map to light the beacons and progress really gets to me. The Grues in the area are also some of the most annoying enemies in the entire game, especially with the unpredictable jump attacks. I actually really like the Farron Keep area where you can gaze out over areas you've been and will be going to later, but it's a small respite in an otherwise pretty miserable place. Bloodborne almost escaped this list, but I had to personally include the Nightmare Frontier. I was conflicted about this because I think the visual design in the area is really strong, and I especially love how you can see parts of other areas creeping in, like the mass from the fishing hamlet. However, this list is primarily concerned with areas that are frustrating to me, and I think this fits the bill. From early on, the player gets ambushed by 2 NPC hunters, and depending on how early you go into this area, they can range from pushover to actual real threat. This is also potentially the first time the player might encounter a brain trust, singing women with far too many eyes, which are among the most terrifying and irritating enemies in the game. In general, it's easy to get lost in the poison swamp that anchors the area, and it makes progress particularly frustrating. While we're talking about swamps, I wanted to descend into the Depraved Chasm in Demon Souls, level 5-1, a part of the Valley of Defilement. Not Blighttown, you say? Well, I actually like Blighttown for what it is. It has pretty clear, defined vertical design, and I think playing through it improves the Dark Souls experience as a whole. However, I find myself having a really hard time with Depraved Chasm, a level that features a constant vertical drop and a game without plunging attacks. The player has to pick off enemies awkwardly through rooftop gaps. What really gets me here is getting ganged up and stun locked by enemies that pop out right when I jump down to lower levels. It also features that merciless huge gap between rest stops that Demon Souls is sort of notorious for, and while there are shortcuts, I find that they don't really help through the areas that give you the most trouble. So, in the intro, I said that a couple of areas definitely push into bad territory, and I have to nudge Tomb of the Giants from Dark Souls 1 into that category, at least in my personal opinion. Nothing about the area is particularly enjoyable to me, and much of it actually verges on sadistic. Having to prep to get specific items just to see properly in the pitch darkness is a pain. And even when one does, they have to get ready to dodge a gauntlet of enemies on the way through. The view of Ash Lake, one of my favorite Soulsborne areas, is a cool touch, but it's a small benefit in a wave of craziness. The final insult is the room full of skeleton babies and multiple pinwheels, topped off with the drop to Nito's boss room with unavoidable fall damage. Have mercy. And finally here, we've slipped into an area I probably would in fact go as far to call bad. The Frigid Outskirts is an unforgiving and infuriating run in the Crown of the Ivory King DLC in Dark Souls 2. Just about everything is rough here, but the biggest issue is the constantly respawning Kirin that shoot extremely hard-hitting lightning at the player. The visibility during the blizzard is bad enough, but these enemies make this area almost comically ridiculous. I have a really hard time justifying this area at all, and it's not even satisfying to clear. At any rate, it definitely takes my top spot for the most frustrating Soulsborne areas. So, there were my personal places in Soulsborne games that caused me the most grief. Like I said in the intro, the fact that I had to think harder about what areas were frustrating speaks volumes to the overall quality of the game's design as a whole. There's also a certain rite of passage one garners from going through the areas, and it's fun to share the laments with other players. Let me know what some of your most frustrating Soulsborne areas are in the comments. I'd be really curious to hear about them. As before, and as always, I appreciate all the support and views. I'm on Patreon at patreon.com/theinfernalrealm, and I stream Soulsborne games, horror, JRPGs, and retro stuff on Twitch as an Infernal One. Thanks again, and keep gaming.